And we have joining us from San Francisco, Rodel Rodis. He is a Filipino American lawyer and the first Filipino American elected to public office in San Francisco, having served in the San Francisco Community College Board, the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, and the San Francisco Civil Grand Jury. He has taught Philippine history and the history of Filipinos in America at San Francisco State University, where he was chair of the Filipino American Studies Program. He's founder of the National Federation of Filipino American Associations and the Filipino Bar Association of Northern California. So,
okay, thank you. It is fitting on the 50th anniversary of the declaration of martial law that we take time to reflect on what lessons we can derive from our resistance to the Marcos dictatorship. It is interesting that that was 50 years ago when Marcos closed the courts and Congress and deprived us of our rights. But at that time, that was only 30 years from when the Filipino people experienced a similar trauma, and that was the Japanese occupation. And much of what happened during the Marcos period happened during the Japanese period. And we did not, back in '72, reflect on what lessons were learned from the resistance to the Japanese. So now, 50 years later, we're looking at what lessons can we learn from the resistance to the Marcos dictatorship. Now, many of us can only reflect on our experience here in the United States. I'm sure Edmund and others will reflect on the experience of the resistance within the Philippines. But here in the United States, we organized opposition. When martial law was declared, by coincidence, we had a newspaper in San Francisco that I had formed, and we had correspondents around the country, and we asked them to come to San Francisco so we could create a network around the US for the newspaper. When we were crossing the Golden Gate Bridge to Marin for this for our conference, our seminar, whatever, we learned martial law was just declared. So we spent the whole weekend planning our opposition and what we were going to do. We organized a nationwide vigil in front of all the Philippine consulates to oppose it. And our central strategy then was that Marcos could not declare martial law without the support of the US, and we have to cut US support for Marcos in order to stop martial law. So we began our campaign by meeting with Senator Cranston of California, and he delivered a speech denouncing Marcos and martial law. And we started working with Congress to cut various bills. And whenever Marcos and Imelda and any of them would come to the US, we were ready with demonstrations, pickets everywhere. And that was critical in terms of our strategy. Now, when we organized the group that the first opposition to Marcos was the National Committee for the Restoration of Civil Liberties in the Philippines. And we got an office at the UNITA's house in Berkeley, where we was our headquarters. And right next door to us was the group fighting the Brazilian dictatorship. And I asked them how long they'd been fighting the Brazilian dictatorship. And the organizers there told me that they'd been fighting them for 7 years. At that time, we were only a few months old. And I said, oh, that's not going to happen to us. The Filipino people would never accept martial law. That our martial law would be over. The people will revolt. That was the confidence that I had back in 1972, 73. And of course, we realized that martial law lasted until 1986, far longer than it took the Brazilians to overthrow their military dictatorship. But that was a sobering lesson as we look back, that we cannot expect that simply because we want something to be so that it will be so. It's a lot of struggle. And many of us have spent the last 50 years fighting much of that dictatorship. And now we're looking forward, if Marcos wins Jr., that we're going to be facing the same thing again. And we will be out in the streets. But this time, instead of being able to lobby Congress to cut the aid, Marcos Jr. will rely on China, not the US, but China to prop up his dictatorship. And as someone pointed out, he doesn't even need to declare martial law. Duterte has laid the grounds for him to rule by decree, to rule with control of the courts and the Congress. So as we discuss, what are we going to do? What lessons have we learned, or can we learn? Can we sum up to plan our opposition to what hopefully doesn't happen? Certainly Loida believes it will not happen, and I share that hope. But we're also realistic that if Marcos Jr. becomes president, that we're ready to go back to what we did back in '72. Thank you.